Good morning and welcome to the first Art in Focus event of 2023. My name is Michelle DiMarzo. I'm the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement here at the Fairfield University Art Museum. And if you are new to this type of event, we do it once a month at 11 a.m. We are in the galleries sitting in a group of whoever turns up to look together at an artwork. And then at noon, we are here on the Quick Live to do it again with you, anyone who may be watching in the virtual space. And then we post it on YouTube for people to watch after the fact. So if you are watching now on the Quick Live, there is a comment box that you can log into. At any point during our conversation, I would be delighted if you would type your observations in and send them along. It's great if this is an interaction between me on one end and you on the other. But helpfully, after talking to folks in the gallery just before, I always come armed with some observations from other people that I can contribute to our conversation, so you're not just listening to one talking head, as it were. So our object that we are discussing this month is this woodblock print by the Japanese artist Hasui. And you'll notice that his name is being indicated in the caption in sort of the Western way, where Hasui is really his, I hesitate to say family name because it was bestowed upon him, but it's not his personal given name. So if this was in a Japanese setting, they would put Hasui in the first position. This is his print. I am not going to attempt to pronounce the Japanese title, but it is called Spring Moon at Ninomiya Beach. And the title is actually indicated running down the right border of the print itself. It was designed in 1932. It's a woodblock print on paper and was a 2018 gift to Fairfield University. And it is with me here in our director's office where I'm doing Art in Focus. Leaning back here, just so you can get a sense of scale. This is a fairly traditional oban size, referring to the dimensions of this particular print. Very common if you've seen other Japanese woodblock prints before. And many people have. I think this is an art form that we in the West are particularly fond of. We think of art objects like Hokusai's Great Wave, for example, is without a doubt the most famous example of Japanese woodblock print production. But that is nearly just about 1 century older than the object we're looking at today. So we're looking at, I don't want to say the end of an artistic tradition, because there are certainly still craftsmen creating ukiyo-e style woodblock prints in Japan today. But if someone like Hokusai is considered one of the pillars of the early tradition of Japanese woodblock printmaking, Hasui has been called sort of the last of the great ukiyo-e masters. In fact, that was part of the title of a 2008 catalog raisonné of his work, bringing all of his more than 600 woodblock prints created over the course of 40 years together. And I think they call it Hasui, the end of the line for ukiyo-e. If you have not heard that word before, ukiyo-e, it refers to the kind of Japanese woodblock print that you may be conjuring in your mind, something like the Great Wave, something like Hiroshige's view of the streets of the theater district of Edo, which was the former name of the city of Tokyo. And in Japanese, that word means the floating world. And it included not only landscapes and scenes of people in everyday life, but also images of actors or courtesans and sort of all of the panoply of late 19th century or mid to late 19th century Japanese life. And they were objects that were created in a format that is reproducible. It's the amazing thing about woodblock prints. Each one is a unique impression. So you've seen ours is sitting right next to me here, but they are part of this larger print run that could be hundreds, could be thousands, and a printing process that can be repeated over many years, as long as the blocks survive in usually the possession of a publisher. So it's a very different model of artistic production than what we might think of an artist with a brush making a single painting or crafting a single stone sculpture, for example. This was always designed to be reproducible, and even in the 19th century was available very cheaply for purchase. But here we are in the early 20th century instead, and Hasui was in many ways the heir of this long-standing Japanese woodblock print tradition. He was not originally trained to be an artist. His family did not want him to be an artist, or they wanted him to run a manga publishing business that had been started by another family member. But he was able eventually to realize his dream of being trained in the manner of ukiyo-e printmakers. As I mentioned, over a 40-year career, he died in 1957. He made more than 600 prints. And many of them, one of his sort of specialties was images of the type that you're seeing here. A landscape, and not just a landscape, but one at night lit by the moon. So you can put his name into Google image search and come up with, the hundreds of images, and you'll see the blue sky and the moon, whether in full moon or sliver, repeating in many of his prints, becoming something like a trademark. He was immensely successful as an artist in his lifetime, and about a year before he died, in I think 1956, he was identified as a Japanese national living treasure because of his role in sort of carrying forward this tradition of Japanese woodblock printing. Jane has asked, were the prints made for purchase mainly by Japanese buyers or for a wider audience? That is a great question. And it really depends on if we're talking about the kind of object we're looking at here or the kind we're thinking about with someone like Hokusai and the Great Wave. That was made for a Japanese audience. They were made for tourists because in thinking of the Great Wave in particular, it was part of a series that showed Fujisan, Mount Fuji, and it was meant to be purchased by Japanese visitors who were visiting Mount Fuji as a holy pilgrimage site. It was something they could take home with them, that and the many other prints in the series. If you know a little bit about Japanese history, you may know that Japan was closed off to the rest of the world until 1853, when American Commodore Matthew Perry forces at gunpoint the Japanese to resume trade with the broader world. And that is such an incredible cross-cultural moment because that is when Western artists like Van Gogh get their first sight of the brilliant color and flattened space and many other techniques that were particular to Japanese artistic style. So there's just this huge explosion of interest in something that had formerly been less known. Moving into the 20th century, of course, Japan had by that point, Japan's history in the early 20th century is an entire different kettle of fish, let's put it that way. But they are very much actors on the world stage. Their art objects are available for purchase by Western audiences. But I would say for a Japanese artist, the primary audience is always going to be fellow Japanese first and foremost. So hopefully, Jane, I answered your question. Although the question of where the provenance of this particular print, I'll come back to in a moment or two. The reactions of our guests who are looking at this print together with me in the gallery was unified, I think, around the calmness, the mood of tranquility that this particular Japanese woodblock print conjures up. And many folks were drawn to the sort of anonymity of the little figure who's moving along the beach. Let's see, did I put a detail on the next slide? Let's find out. Oh, there it is. The figure on the beach who, in complete silhouette, impossible to tell if that's a man or a woman, possibly carrying something over one shoulder. Just very difficult to make out any precise details. But there is this overwhelming sort of element of calm and tranquility. Very easy, I think, to imagine the sort of lapping of waves against the shoreline. And you might be able to see there at the right, I mentioned the title of the print itself is given by the designer. It is in Japanese characters on the white edge of the paper, or I should say tan. It's not quite white here. And his signature is inside the border of the image itself. So it's appearing on the right edge above the sort of reddish round circle that may be the mark of the publisher. I'm just going to go back here to this main view. What else did I want to say about this? Or should I say, what else can I steal from our guest observations? Well, this at a glance, I think appears to be a very simple image. We are perhaps standing, we the viewer, at a slightly elevated position. We seem to be looking down onto this promontory from which the trees are growing at the right. Further below is the beach. The person seems very small. And then the ocean stretches out on the other side. The more we looked at it and talked about it together in the gallery, other folks pointed out that there is a level of ambiguity here that they found a little bit confusing. And the ambiguity lies in the clouds. So one of our visitors was trying to figure out how exactly could those clouds, if indeed everything above the distant horizon line is a cloud, how are they all so gray? Would this actually make sense? And we can see in the uppermost layer of cloud, there's a sense that moonlight is striking an upper layer and not the lower. But it's really the solid band of gray that's moving along the horizon with then a sort of darker gray in the center. I'm going to go back and see if there we go. So we're talking about what's appearing here at the top of our detail. They began to discuss, could that darker gray area, perhaps that's not cloud. Maybe are we seeing another landform? Are we perhaps in a sort of bay? And if this figure continued walking along the beach, would they come around in a U to find themselves on the other side of what we're seeing there? And for me, this was fascinating because I have looked at this particular print many times, and I had always interpreted what was in the horizon as all of it was some sort of atmospheric mass. I had never thought anything more of it really than that until we were taking the time to sort of look at it closely together. Yeah, and I'm glad I included this in there. So I showed to them in the gallery that there is a website, and I realize I've put the URL slightly incorrect. It should be ukiyo with a dash a.org. And it's just a database that if you know the title of a particular Japanese woodblock print, you can put it in, and they will give you as many impressions as they can find in databases and museum collections around the world. So for example, this is the same print as the one in Fairfield's collection. At the top of the screen, you're seeing an example that belongs to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so the great thing about the website is you can click on an individual one. If you clicked on that Museum of Fine Arts, it would take you to the museum's website. Ideally, taking you right to the collection page for that object does not always work. There are some other examples at the Chazen Museum of Art, which is the University of Wisconsin, I believe, and others that are coming from these various open collection databases. One of the reasons that I was interested to show this both on my iPad in the gallery and to you is it's really good to be reminded that these are not unique objects by their very nature. There are so many other of them. Now, granted, depending on the particular design, there may be hundreds of impressions that survive and are known in museum collections. There may be relatively few. But it also is really interesting to see the difference. Even in looking at these tiny little thumbnails on screen, you might be able to notice that the colors are different. There are some that are very richly blue throughout. There are some that seem desaturated or faded. And there are distinctions between the MFA Boston one at the top of our screen, which is a very fine quality impression, and the one that belongs to Fairfield. Now, I'm not going to go back and forth too much. In Art in Focus, we always want to keep our focus on the art object in front of us. But this print is not all blue top to bottom. There's this very clear insertion of a green band marking the area of the beach. There are other distinctions. We noticed together looking at the image of the one from the MFA that the cloud versus landmass issue across the horizon was much easier to understand, that there did seem to be a gray landmass and then a cloud barrier, but it was much more ambiguous in the print we were looking at in front of us and much less ambiguous in one in another museum's collection. So if you know something about the process of making Japanese woodblock prints, you know that it is very much a collaborative one. So although we credit this print to an individual named Hasui, in reality, he painted, he created a drawing, a colored drawing, painting, drawing, and he brings that to usually a publisher who oversees the production of the print by turning first to highly skilled wood carvers who create the different blocks that will be needed to create the final print, and working also with specialized printers, the people who are applying the ink, water-based ink, to the individual blocks, pressing down the sheets, rubbing them in with sort of a flat paddle-looking tool, and pulling off each individual impression. So behind each Japanese woodblock print, there is a hive of activity. And unfortunately, just due to the nature, our desire for, I would say, an individual to whom to assign each art object, we usually give only the name of the designer of the print itself. Occasionally, we know the name of the publisher. They may have left their mark or their name on the print, but almost never are the wood carvers or printers who actually labored to create the physical objects that fill our museums, almost never are their names known and shared. And I, in fact, do not know the names of these wood carvers or printers to share with you. But one of the things that comes out of this being a group process that is repeated many times is that you wind up with variation. And the variations could have any number of reasons. One of the variations that could happen over long periods of time, the publisher owns the right to those wood blocks. They can continue having that print printed as long as there is a consumer audience for it. And what that might mean is that the same pieces of wood are being repeatedly rubbed by the paddle that is intended to make sure the ink adheres or is sucked into the paper. And you can imagine in delicate areas where there is a thin line of wood sticking up, those are going to be sensitive to snapping over time. And if you look closely, for example, at the bottom edge of this image, you might be able to make out that in the black contour line that creates the frame of what we're looking at, it's not perfectly smooth. There seem to be little chips, little areas of absence. That is the key block, the black outlines block. Those little pieces of wood had broken. This is clearly an object, an impression of this print that had been produced much later than, for example, if you looked at the impression of the print at MFA in Boston, it is a perfect smooth line of black ink across the bottom of the print. So sometimes there are those sort of clues in the object itself that tell us something about where it shows up in time. You'll notice that when I gave the caption for this object, it said 1832. 1832 is when Hasui designs it, is when the first print run happens. But it is very difficult in Japanese woodblock prints to know the precise date of printing of every individual impression. The best we can say with this one is that it's probably not very early, but how long was the publisher printing? Were they even printing impressions of this print after the original artist had died? It's very possible. Oh, and I forgot, I did have that detail image of the bottom where you can really see the chips that are slightly taken out because the integrity of that piece of the woodblock had deteriorated that little bit over time. I brought back on screen the caption for this image because you can see at the end of the caption, it explains, as museums always will, how did they acquire the object? I always like to tell my students that to me, it's very fascinating, the question of provenance, which if you have not heard that word before, refers to ideally being able to know every transfer of ownership in an art object's history from when it left the creator to when it arrived to wherever it is today. So in a perfect world, wouldn't we love to know this object was created in this state, was sold to this person, then was bequeathed to their nephew, and then it goes here and here. I mean, the amount of information you'd be able to understand about the movement of art objects around the world would be extraordinary. In fact, it varies very much between art objects, what we know and what we don't know. So my art history students right now are looking at Mona Lisa, and I joke to them that it's a very short provenance because it goes Leonardo da Vinci to the King of France, and then royal collections right into the Louvre, the National Museum of France today. It's a very short provenance, in other words. And there are many other times where we simply don't have the information to fill in. The information that a museum will usually be able to give is at least how did they get it directly? Like, who gave it to them, or did they buy it? So you're seeing on screen gift of Jennifer and Vincent Tranquillo from 2018. This print is very familiar to me, this impression, because this is my sister and brother-in-law. They donated kindly the print to the museum. It was one that had been in our childhood home, having been purchased by our parents on their honeymoon in San Francisco in 1980. That is as far back as the provenance of this particular impression of the print can go. When did it arrive in that gallery? How recently had it been printed in Japan? When did it travel to the United States? Had it had any previous owners before that? Unfortunately, we don't have any of that information. I was joking with our visitors that even though I could say, yes, my sister donated this object to our museum, know that my family were not art collectors. I think, were taking it home a nice souvenir of something they saw and they enjoyed in a shop. I doubt that they would have paid an extraordinarily high price for it, just knowing that that would not have occurred to them to do, I think, at that point in their lives. So it's interesting the little bits of information that we may know. And for me, as an art historian, it was interesting to see this object enter our collection as a museum object, as opposed to, oh, that thing that was in the frame, that was in the dining room for all of those years, that, is part of the environment of the place you grow up in, but maybe you don't take a moment to really look at. So delighted to have the next piece of this object story be here at Fairfield. Um, there's something else I was going to say about that, but I totally forgot. Anyway, well, if it comes to me, I'll say it. If it doesn't come to me, I won't. The other thing that I am delighted to share with you all this morning is that a frequent attendee and watcher of Art in Focus who could not be with us even online today, Janet Krause, who is Professor Emerita of the Department of English here at Fairfield University. She had looked at the object in advance and had been inspired to create a short poem based on it, which she invited me to share with you all today, which I was just so delighted by. So her poem is here. Oops, just moving this out of my line of sight. The dark of night intrudes on the blue of sky, still claiming its space. The shaggy-fingered boughs of a tree beckon turtle-shaped clouds swimming to shore. They do not cast shadows over the ocean the moon guards with an endless sheet of porous light. And I have to say, I really appreciate that last image, a sheet of porous light. Because as you look at the image of the ocean there that is dappled with not just white caps near the shore, but all of these little dashes of white echoing ripples in the surface of water. Imagine what that meant, the physical block, every one of those a little divot that would be carved out so that it would not take ink when the printmaker inked up that block to create that portion of the painting. It would truly have almost been porous in the nature of making the artwork itself. So thank you so much to Janet for contributing her poem to our experience of this particular object. If anyone has any observations or any questions that they would like to share, besides those that have already been shared, please feel free to put those into the chat. I'm really trying to grasp what it was that I was planning on saying before, and it is not coming to me. Although as I'm looking at this on screen, and now that I'm thinking again of this object in my family's dining room, I recall that it was matted with an overmat. The one we have it in here, you see it's just sort of a regular off-white matting. The one that it was matted in, the frame that my parents had it in, was a very pale seafoam green, which I assume was chosen because it, went very nicely with the sort of greenish tint to the beach. And I don't know if that was framed for them by the shop when they took it home or if they had it framed when they returned home after their trip. But interesting how, yeah, that had just struck to my mind, seeing that green on screen right now. Yeah, I think that is all for today. Thank you so much for joining us for Art in Focus. The feature object next will be March 2nd. Is going to be a work from our show that is currently on view in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries. This is Norma Minkowitz's Body to Soul. So if you are available at 11 a.m. that day, please feel free to join us in person. Or if not, I will look forward to seeing you here on the Quick Live. And thank you, and I hope you have a peaceful rest of your day.